move forward in.
Since nobody sits in it. That's the normal scheme of things, isn't it?
Testing. Hey, there we go. All right. Bear with me a little bit this morning. I've got a little bit of a cough. I promise it's not the Rona, but I'll be popping down cough drops throughout. Let's go ahead and get started with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, that you are the sovereign God of history, that you reign and you rule over all, and that all things work according to your plan. We ask that as we delve into the first chapter of Daniel and see how not only the conquest of Israel, but the preservation of your people was all according to your will, that would give us hope and a thrill to see your kingdom fully culminated, Lord. We ask these things in your name. Amen. All right, beginning in Daniel 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Daniel 1:1 gives us the first date in the book, and he also gives us the historical context for everything else that happens afterwards in the book. If we look at the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, that equates to the year 605 BC. And it's in 605 BC that Nebuchadnezzar is campaigning throughout Syria and Palestine. Earlier that summer, he had effectively delivered what was the final blow to the Assyrian Empire at the Battle of Carchemish, where he finally defeated the Assyrians. The Egyptians were forced to flee, went back into Egypt, effectively became a non-power in the ancient Near East after that. And it's after that victory, which was up in what is now eastern Syria, that Nebuchadnezzar then follows the path of the Egyptians and he comes down into Syria, Palestine. And towards the end of August of 605 BC, he conquers Jerusalem. He's then forced to return to Babylon shortly after that because of the death of his father Nabopolassar, and so he returns to Babylon to claim the throne for himself. This is now one of those points where I said we have to take some brief excursus to talk about dates and conflicts within the book of Daniel. This is one of those areas. That date of 605 BC, dated as the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, is by some scholars considered to be proof that Daniel is full of errors. Because if you jump over to Jeremiah 25:1, it says that the word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. That was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So they'll say, well, Daniel can't even get his dates right. Jeremiah says it's the fourth year, Daniel says it's the third year. Again, this is easily resolved if we realize there's two different ways to keep track of regnal years within the ancient Near East. The first system, which Jeremiah uses, counts partial years as full years of a king's reign. So if I'm elevated to the kingship and I take over in July, even though I might only be king for 6 months till the end of the year, guess what? That's year 1. January 1st rolls over, and guess what? That's year 2. Daniel uses the second method of date keeping, which is that partial years don't count. And so if I took over in July and I served for 6 months as king, guess what? My first regnal year doesn't start until January 1st. So, again, there is no discrepancy. Jeremiah reckons regnal years one way, Daniel another, and there is no conflict historically in the book of Daniel. But returning back to verses 1 and 2, the key to these verses, and I would also maintain throughout most of the rest of the book, is that the conquest and exile that Nebuchadnezzar enforced upon Judah occurred because it says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, in verse 2. And this sets up that repeated theme throughout the book that all events within history occur because of God's decree and foreordination. In particular, the events of the book of Daniel occur because of several promises by God. This occurs first because God judges Judah for their sins. And this harkens all the way back to the covenant that was enacted in the Pentateuch, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, where God promises to judge the nations if they do not abide by the covenant. So Leviticus 26, verses 33 and 39. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheathe the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation. Your cities shall be a waste. And those of you who are left shall rot away in your enemies' lands because of their iniquity. And also because of the iniquities of their fathers, they shall rot away like them. Deuteronomy 28:64, and the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And then the second reason that this occurs as a promise from God is because God pronounced judgment upon King Hezekiah and his descendants for an act of faithlessness. 2 Kings 20 has Hezekiah welcoming in the envoys of Babylon and showing them the stores of his treasure house. And we miss some of this because we're not living in the political age of, the 7th century BC, and we don't know all the ins and outs that's going on here, but a little bit of history reveals Israel had already been conquered, Judah's under pressure from the Assyrian Empire. And so Babylon shows up on their doorstep. And when Hezekiah shows them his treasury, it's just not like hey, by the way, I'm giving you a tour, here's this room, look at all the pretty stuff inside. Rather, it's a subtle indication that, look, if you come to my aid, I have all this money. I can fund you, I can support you, I can push along your conquest if you defeat the Assyrians for us. In effect, Hezekiah was declaring that he was no longer looking to God for protection, but to political alliance. Hence, the judgment of 2 Kings 20, verses 17 and 18, where God says to him, "Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And so the Lord is shown to be faithful, even in his judgments, to accomplish what he declares to be. Verses 3 through 5. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned to them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. It was fairly common in the ancient Near East that if you conquered a land, what did you do with the populace of that land? Yeah, did you Larry said destroy them, and Dave said take them as slaves. That is correct. Because if you have people that are tied to a place and to a home, and you've conquered that, what's going to be their natural reaction? What are they going to want to do? They're going to want to rebel and take it back. So if you strip them from the land and you take them someplace that they are not familiar with, that they have no ties to, that is not home, what are they going to be less likely to do? They're going to be less likely to rebel. And so it happens with Judah, because the stripping of the royal family and the nobility from the land effectively does that. It takes away those people that had been trained to be leaders and government officials, those that would have been most skilled in leading a reconquest of the land. From the Babylonian perspective, it also provides a ready conscript of officials for the Babylonian court. Because notice the way that the youths that are taken from Judah are described. They're described both in appearance and in skill. It says they are youth without blemish, of good appearance, verse 4. And then also in verse 4, it says that they are skillful in wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. Now, one of the ways that the book of Daniel has been used is this idea of dare to be a Daniel. Dare to be somebody that stands up under social pressure, dare to be the person that takes a public stand and fights for God. Now, does that occur in the book of Daniel? Yes, it does. Where that idea becomes problematic is when we take the context of Daniel where it says that these were youths and we apply that to our own children. Because I've heard it more than once, some of you might have as well, that we can let our children be Daniels. We can put them out in places where they can witness and they can do these things and they can dare to take a stand in public. There's a caveat there, though. Because what were the use of Daniel? They were wise, they were already educated, they were already trained to be government officials. These are people that are 12 to 15 years old, more than likely, because they were still youths, but they were at the point within Israelite culture they would have been considered adults. They would have been trained from the time that they were young children to that point to fill very specific roles within the government. They already had an education. They already had the know-how how to operate within society. They were already fully functioning people. What we cannot do is take that mantra and apply it to children that we have not educated well, that we have not trained up in the word of the Lord, that we have not brought to that point, and shove them out in an environment where they are not going to be able to survive and say, go be a Daniel. That is incredibly dangerous. It is a misappropriation of this text. There's also a subtle indication of the status of these youths and how Daniel refers to them in this very first mention, in that he says they are the people of Israel. Now again, historical context here matters, because did they come from the nation of Israel? Historically, did they come from the nation of Israel? No, they did not. Israel split as a nation, right? And so there were two nations, Israel and Judah. Israel as a nation had been destroyed over a century earlier. Judah had just been destroyed. And what you see throughout the rest of the book is that when Daniel refers to himself or his friends, he consistently describes themselves as the Judeans or the exiles of Judah. So why does it matter here that he refers to them as they were of the people of Israel? Well, there's theological impetus behind that statement. There's a deeper context that Daniel wants us to pick up on. And it's that these are people that are continuing the story that had begun centuries earlier. Because where did Israel come from? Well, their father was Abraham. And Abraham had many sons. Right? And those sons have their children, and they have their children. And eventually, those children end up where? They end up in Egypt as what? Slaves. People that are yearning for the promised land that had been given to Abraham, and yet in bondage. And God rescues them from that exile and takes them home. What has now happened to the people of Judah? They've been stripped of their land, they've been sent to exile. What are they hoping for? They're hoping for the return to their land. And so there's a theological tie there. Daniel wants us to see in the stand that these men take ties to the rescue from exile that occurred with Moses. Once the Babylonians have these children, they begin the process of assimilating them into the court to make them fit for service. They begin by teaching them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And this may seem like a minor thing, but its force as a tool for assimilation should not be underestimated. Because the stories we tell radically affect how we perceive and understand the world. When we talk about myths, when we talk about cultural stories, we need to understand these aren't stories that are just so stories like Aesop's fables. Rather, they're stories that shape how we perceive the world around us and how we think. Did the ancient Greeks really believe that Zeus fathered a bunch of random children out in the world? And no, they didn't actually believe that. But the way that they told stories about Zeus shaped how they perceived and understood reality. In the same way, by teaching the children of Judah the stories of Babylon, what are they doing? They're making them think the way the Babylonians do. In the same way, the way that we speak, the way that we use language, radically affects how we think and how we perceive. We take this for granted because we don't appreciate the depths of language. But the way that you use language will radically change your perception of reality. As an example of this, if you've ever read Homer, he talks about Odysseus sail across the sea, and he describes the seas as a very weird color. Does anybody know what they are? No classicists, okay. Homer describes the seas as being wine dark. How many people here have ever looked at the ocean and thought, that looks like wine? Anybody? But you know what they found out going back through historical studies? The color blue does not exist naturally in nature in very many places. And so for most ancient cultures, they did not have a name for the color blue. And so what did they most closely associate perceiving water as? Wine. There have been later studies done through University of London and some of these other universities that have demonstrated that the way that we name colors dictates how we perceive color. There are cultures that have 10 different words for green and no words for blue. If you show them a range of colors that go from green to blue, guess what? Green, 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 green. And if you hold up different shades of blue against that, they won't be able to tell the difference because everything to them will look green. You put up shades of green that we couldn't tell the difference between, guess what? They can see the differences between them. And so language shapes how you perceive and how you react to reality. And by forcing the Judean children to adopt the language of the Chaldeans and to adopt their history and their stories and their educational system, they are trying to force them into their mold. The other thing that they do with them is they assign them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. This, again, is part of the assimilation tactic. Because by giving them this food of the best portions, it's going to foster a sense of dependency and also thankfulness. And the weight of the issue here isn't even that the food would have been dedicated to a false god first. More than likely, when we get later into the story and Daniel requests grains and vegetables, those grains and vegetables had also probably been dedicated to a false god. So it's not the dedication of the food that mattered. What mattered was the constant provision from the king that would alter the exiles' view of themselves and their place in that society. Verses 6 and 7. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. The next way that the Babylonians attempted to reshape the identities of these exiles is by giving them new names. And there's a fundamental strength to names that we in the West do not appreciate. The Hebrew names of the four exiles in question reflected an identity marker. It wasn't just a name, it was a assigning of a character, of a personage to them that went deeper. All four of their names are theocentric in meaning. Daniel means my judge is God. Hananiah means graciousness is Yahweh. Mishael means who is what God is. Azariah means Yah has helped. In parallel to that, the Babylonian names that are assigned are focused on the gods of the Babylonians. Because Daniel is called Belteshazzar. May Bel protect his life. Shadrach means likely the command of Marduk. Meshach, who is what Aku is. Abednego, servant of Nebo. And so this attempt at assimilation is further indicated by the language that Daniel uses to describe this naming process. Because the normal Hebrew to designate something with a name is kara shem. Literally, it means to call a name. But Daniel uses a different Hebrew construct here. He uses sum shem, to set upon a name. And this construction of to set upon is used in Numbers 6:27 for God setting his name upon a people. It's God setting his character, setting his stamp upon them. And so the implication in Daniel is that by giving them these names that reference their gods, what are they trying to do? They're trying to put the stamp of their gods on these men. They want to make them into the image of their false idols. Interestingly, Daniel and his companions do not rebel or fight against the giving of the new names, even though they fundamentally are designed to alter their identities. But what is to be noticed is throughout the text, whenever Daniel or the others refer to themselves or to each other, so Daniel chapter 2, when he has to go and spends the night in prayer with Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, when they refer to themselves, they always call each other by their Hebrew names. Other instances of the Babylonian names throughout the text, so when they are called Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those instances occur when it's either a Babylonian, Persian, official that's talking to them. And it may be, however, that they did chafe at the name somewhat and found subtle ways to show their displeasure. Because if you go through the text, the Babylonian names are subtly disfigured throughout. Belteshazzar is not the proper spelling or pronunciation. It's Belshazzar. Shadrach is corrupted by leaving off the full designation of Marduk. The name should actually be longer. They cut off part of the god's name. Meshach is corrupted by leaving off the full designation of Aku. Abednego is a corruption of the proper name, Abednabu. So it's like they found ways to say, yes, you gave me this name. I'll tolerate it. I'll allow you to use it. But guess what? I'm still not going to take on your God's identity. Think then of the context of our own time and the pressures that we face from the culture around us to assimilate. We've effectively given over storytelling and poetry to a culture that hates us. What sort of stories should we then expect, and how should we expect them to shape our thinking? We just spent an entire 13 weeks talking about culture and how it shapes and how we react to it and how we think about it. And the fact that storytelling is so powerful, if we have garbage stories coming in, we will have garbage character coming out. We speak the language of the culture and have lost much of the language and acts that set apart the church from the broader culture for close to 2 millennia. We have left behind the rites and the rituals and the traditions of the church that made us stand apart from the culture and gave us our own language and identity. Even more critically, doctrines are being abandoned in the broader Western Christianity that are distinct and essential to our survival and our identity. Because we're allowing our identity and our culture to be defined for us. How many of us have sought to be a Christian that isn't like those other Christians? I'm not combative like them. You can talk to me about these things. I'm okay with this as long as you're cool with it. And yeah, I have this opinion, but it's just really my opinion. And if homosexuality is cool as long as you do this, and that does no one any good. We've too easily bought into the lines that we're either hardcore weirdos if we cling to our distinctiveness, or that we need to be easygoing non-troublemakers. The simple truth is we need to walk that middle line. We need to be loving troublemakers. We need to be a little bit weird. If we are not culturally distinct, if the world cannot look at us and go, there is something just off about you guys, you don't fit in, you don't fit the mold, what makes you the way you are, we're doing it wrong. First half of verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. And so Daniel sets himself to resist assimilation. And this is in parallel to verse 7, because in verse 7 it says they set upon them a name, and in verse 8, Daniel sets upon his heart. Bill T. Arnold, commenting on this, says, the irony of the wordplay is that the Babylonians think they have changed Daniel's character, but the narrator knows otherwise. The wordplay in verse 8 is the narrator's full portrait of Daniel and transcends even the description of his impressive personal and intellectual skills in verses 3 to 4. It is his commitment to God that sets Daniel apart and prepares the reader for the continued conflict between aggressive world powers and God's servants. And it's important here that the Hebrew concept of the heart includes not only the emotional capabilities of the person, but also the intellectual capacities and the will. And so, in effect, Daniel is setting his entire being against defilement, against assimilation. And so the question becomes, what exactly was Daniel attempting to avoid in becoming defiled? There have been multiple possibilities that have been given for the refusal to eat the king's food. These range from, again, the assimilation process of being fully integrated into the culture and beholden to the king. It's been put forward that he was trying to avoid non-kosher foods since there were restrictions on the preparation that would not have been followed. It's been argued that he doesn't want to eat foods that have been dedicated to idols. The text isn't clear. But whatever the reason, to partake of those foods for Daniel would have been to defile himself and to be a part of that assimilation process. And he says, no. Picking up in the latter half of verse 8. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. What's Daniel's solution to avoid being defiled? Well, first off, he attempts to work within the culture. Because who does he approach first? The chief of the eunuchs, to see if he can get an exemption. Now, the request is denied, but not because of any flaw in Daniel or in his request. Notice that Daniel has favor and compassion from the chief eunuch. Rather, it's denied because who does the chief eunuch fear more than Daniel? The king. What does the chief eunuch want to avoid having happen to him? He doesn't want his head rolling across the floor. And at that point, Daniel's solution is not to cave and to bow to the Babylonian program. Rather, what does he do? He takes a step back, both in the strength of the request and in the person to whom he makes the request of. Because rather than going back to the chief eunuch, he goes to the steward. Excuse me. Promise it's not the Rona. Rather than going back to the chief eunuch, he goes to the steward that the eunuch set over them. And rather than asking for a full exemption, he asks instead that their diet be modified for 10 days. I think Andrew went to get me water. Give me a moment. I got cough drops. I got one in. Thank you, sir. Okay, there are a couple things to notice here. First, Daniel exhibits wisdom in dealing with those in a culture that are hostile to their beliefs. He doesn't flat out refuse to be a part of the Babylonian court and education system, but he does refuse to compromise on those things that are truly important. And he approaches the problem in a way that shows that he is not attempting to undermine authority, those that are set over him, the steward or the chief eunuch, because he allows the authority to set the experiment and to judge the effects of that experiment on their own. Basically says, if you decide that this doesn't work out, guess what? I will do exactly what you want me to do. I will follow your authority. The second thing that we can see is that the request and the time period show an implicit trust that God would honor the request and provide the means to not be defiled. 10 days is an exceptionally short period of time to test and compare two radically different diets. Right? The other thing that happens here is that the results are surprising. And it proves God's care for Daniel and his companions. Because it says not only were they better in appearance, but what else? Better in appearance, fatter in flesh. Now, I'm chubby, I like to eat. One of the things that I know is that if I want to lose weight, I cut out the rich meat and the alcohol and things like that, and what do I eat instead? I eat like a rabbit, I eat vegetables. So after 10 days, if you're eating a strictly vegetarian diet and you're expecting to see that one group has gained weight, one group has lost weight, which group do you expect to see be that group? Not Daniel. You expect it to see the Babylonians. Verses 17 through 20. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of the kingdom. And this is the point in the narrative when that which has been implicit is now made explicit. The good favor and the wisdom of Daniel and his friends comes not from themselves, it comes from God. And God's care and his gift to the young men are threefold. First, they are given knowledge. In the Hebrew and throughout the Old Testament, this refers to not just intellectual knowledge, but the ability to integrate knowledge into faith and prudential living. They also are given understanding and insight. And this has the connotation throughout the Old Testament, in other passages, of a spiritual insight, of the ability to follow God's laws when circumstances would seem to dictate that you should do otherwise. And then finally, they are given wisdom. And again, in the Old Testament, this includes spiritual knowledge, the ability to apply spiritual knowledge into life. And then further, to Daniel, is given the exceptional ability to interpret dreams and visions, which, guess what? That comes into play later. This is also further explicitly drawn out because this is the third time within the narrative to this point that something is given. Daniel 1:2. Jehoiakim is given over to the Babylonians. By whom? By God. Daniel 1:9. Daniel is given favor with the chief eunuch. By whom? By God. Daniel 1:17. The youth are given knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. By whom? By God. In what is perhaps a bit of rhetorical hyperbole, Daniel and his companions are described as being 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters. Now, is this a literal, direct quantification of their skills compared to everybody else? No. But it's a rhetorical method to demonstrate the exceptional skill and gifting with which God has blessed them. Ian DeGuede points out in his commentary on Daniel that the results of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah experiences are of a I butchered that. He points out that the result of Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah's experiences are a result of God's answering of Solomon's prayer for his people. Because Solomon had prayed at the dedication of the temple that the people would be able to find compassion from those who took them captive if they repented and sought God in captivity. It's also interesting, that passage, Solomon assumes they're going into captivity. If you read through that prayer, Solomon assumes they will fail in the covenant, they will go into captivity, and part of his prayer is that when you are in captivity, may you find compassion from the people who have taken you captive. 1 Kings 8:49 and 50. Then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them. And so God's blessing to the youth extended not only to their wisdom and understanding, but also to the fact that they received favor and compassion from their captors. And then we end with verse 21. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. This short, almost throwaway verse also speaks to God's preservation of his people. Again, we don't live in this culture, we don't follow the dates, we don't always follow the history. But the first year of King Cyrus was the year in which the exiles were permitted to return to their lands and given leave to rebuild the temple. That happens in 2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23. Does anybody know roughly the time frame that it passes? It's roughly 70 years. It's between 635 and 630 BC that Cyrus issues the decree that allows the Jews to go home. And so Daniel serves faithfully. He's preserved, he's kept for 70 years of exile. And it's a promise in that statement that God will maintain his people. That there is coming a time for us when we will exit our exile. Right? We touched on this last week. There is coming a kingdom, which we will deal with next week, that will crush all other kingdoms that we belong to. And as God preserved these young men, as God preserved these young men because they faithfully sought him, because they were willing to resist assimilation, that they were willing to be the people that stood out in their culture and kept that stand of fidelity to God. He preserved them, he will preserve us. Our exile will someday come to an end. Okay. Questions over Daniel 1? Going once, going twice. Okay. Brief reminder, we do have lunch after service today. They have asked that this Sunday school class clean up after the lunch. Doesn't take a lot of people, but it does take some. So if you could stay after the majority of people have left to help vacuum, put away tables, clean up, that would be great. Would be very much appreciated. So, all right. Party's over. You don't have to go home, but you should stay here.